All right, welcome everyone. I'm Yolanda and I'm with Trapeta Mayson. And we're here as part of Black Women Writing Short Stories. And we are today having a conversation with Mecca Jamilah Sullivan. Mecca Jamilah Sullivan is a proud native of Harlem, New York, the author of the short story collection Blue Talk and Love, winner of the Judith Markowitz Award from the Lambda Literary, and a book ancestor in Tazake Shange called Outstanding.
Mm.
Sullivan holds a Ph.D. in English Lit from the University of Pennsylvania, an M.A. in English and Creative Writing from Temple University, my alma mater, and a B.A. in Afro-American Studies from Smith College. Her short stories have been published widely. Sullivan has been honored for her work with the Pushcart Prize nomination, the James Baldwin Memorial Playwriting Award, honors from the National Endowment from the Arts, the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Yaddo Colony, the Hedgebrook Writers Retreat, among others. Sullivan's critical and scholarly work on sexuality, identity, and poetics in contemporary African diaspora culture has appeared in numerous publications. Her research and scholarship have earned support from the Mellon Mays Foundation, the Social Sciences Research Council, Williams College, Rutgers University, Duke University, and the American Academy of University Women. Sullivan is an assistant professor of English at Bryn Mawr College, where she teaches courses in African American poetry and poetics, Black feminist literature, and creative writing. Her forthcoming book, The Poetics of Difference, Queer Feminist Forms in the African Diaspora, explores the politics of experiment in Black, queer, and feminist literary cultures. And she is completing a novel that we are eagerly awaiting. So welcome,
Yes.
Mecca.
Welcome.
Thank
You so much.
you with us. This is like the
I'm really,
official Yolanda and Trapeta podcast that no one knows about, but here we are.
I know, the world is ready for it. We need
Yes,
It's
So,
ready, and we are honored to have you. And we're gonna bring forth the spirits of our students also to say, I know they're honored to have you in their midst, even those in interview where they're thrilled and they're honored to have you. So welcome.
I'm excited to engage their voices and their questions.
Yes.
this
So
is a
we're gonna
question I
get
just like
started.
to ask people nowadays. How are you living? How are you sleeping these days?
Wow, this is a really good question, and I think it's the right question to start off any real conversation, in this time we're living in. I'm living well. I'm living, right? So I think that's a huge blessing, and I'm grateful for that. My people generally are living as well and doing all right. So I feel like I'm living in gratitude. I've got space, I've got time, I've got the resources that I need, and lots of love in my life. So I'm living well. Sleeping is kind of like sporadic. It's interesting. I started off quarantine really kind of like on a whole grind. I did a lot of work on the novel, in fact, and I was really kind of like, I had my setup and my structure and everything was consistent. And as the months, have gone on, I think I'm in a more kind of flexible sleep schedule. But I'm trying to embrace that as well. As an artist, I'm kind of like, all right, if I'm up at 4 a.m. and the words are flowing, I'm gonna flow with them. And if it's time for a nap at 4 p.m, that's what we're gonna do. And I feel grateful to be able to have that flexibility.
Right.
So yeah, how about y'all? How are y'all doing?
Everything you said.
Yeah, pretty much.
Gratitude, I think, is at the top of the list. And then the other part is just taking it day by day.
Yeah.
Day by day, as it relates to even sleep. It's just day by day. Every day is a new adventure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I'm always finding new ways to slow down in ways I didn't know I could go slower.
Right.
But somehow, like, my life is always speeding up, and I have to kind of find ways to just grab it back.
Yeah.
So, and sleep is one of those ways. So,
Yeah.
I try to encourage it,
Yeah.
make time for it.
Yeah.
So, I'm wondering, I know this is a question that our students will want to know. How did you become a writer?
Well, you brought in our ancestor Ntozake Shange, which I appreciate. She was a beloved, sort of model, mentor, and became a friend in recent years. And so, she's a big part of my sort of coming into my writing life story. When I was 11 years old, the same year, 5th grade, I read For Colored Girls, who have considered suicide when the rainbow's enough. And I read The Bluest Eye. And Sassafras, I kind of discovered Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, which is also by Ntozake Shange. And, you know, I was 11. I was, by all accounts, too young to be reading and understanding any of those texts. And yet I was also the perfect age, you know, the time when I really realized, especially The Bluest Eye and Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo, in fact, because these are stories about Black girls, right? And they were about young Black girls. And when I realized that this could be a life, that you could make a life out of writing stories like the one I was living at the moment, that was possible to do, and that could be a way to spend a whole life, I was in. I was like, this is it, you know? And so pretty much from that moment in. And I was fortunate to have parents who really encouraged me, teachers who really encouraged me. So I've been identifying as a writer pretty much since the 5th grade, which, you know, seems kind of absurd in a way, but also it's been really helpful to cling to that, you know, through other career paths and different kind of moments in life, to sort of really understand that writing has always been central to how I understand my place in the world. And it's always helped me move through the world.
You know,
so that's interesting.
Right, go ahead.
No, I was just saying it's interesting about the 5th grade, because I hear a lot of people talk about, first of all, I've read all those books many times over, so I identify with you, and was too young to read them too. So, but it's interesting that, you know, to hear a writer say, well, I've identified as a writer since 5th grade, because normally we're all having these angst about, are we a writer, aren't we a writer? And then we can kind of go all the way up to our 20s and sometimes our 30s. But I'm curious to know, identifying as a writer at that age, was it poetry, or did you jump right into fiction, nonfiction? Because you're writing, it's very poetic in a lot of the language. So I was curious about that. What was your first genre of writing?
So thank you for that. First of all, anytime, you know, someone tells me my writing is poetic, you know, grateful. Like, I admire poets. It means a lot coming from y'all, especially. I admire the work that poets do. And for me, you know, I think that when you're, you know, in the 5th grade, right, my understanding of what it meant to be a writer was kind of to the writing I was exposed to and how genres were explained to me. And so at that time, I was writing poetry. I was thinking about poetry, but I was also writing stories and little essays. And I think happily, it wasn't until I was kind of approaching my 20s that I realized that, like, you know, the way these genres and the separation between genres have become so institutionalized. As an 11-year-old, I was like, I'm a writer. So if I'm writing, it's writing, I'm doing my job. And then, you know, you start to take classes and as an undergrad and realize, okay, the poetry class is separate from the fiction class. I mean, when you know, get to that MFA, MA zone, you know, they could be them, sometimes are separate worlds. And then now as an academic, it's this other separation that none of these kind of genre or even discipline distinctions have ever really felt organic to me, you know? And so for that reason, I think I write in a lot of different genres. I don't tend to write poetry now, only because I do feel this real sort of reverence for poets and what poets do. And there's a part of me that feels, I don't think I'll ever call myself a poet, but I feel honored when people tell me that my writing is poetic, if that makes sense. You know?
It makes sense. Thank you. Thank you.
So I love one of my favorite stories in the book is Wolfpack. And I remember the first time I read it was on the way back from the Hobart Writers Festival, Women Writers Festival, where I met you. Right. And I bought the book. I didn't have a whole lot of money that weekend to buy a lot of books, but I was like, I was very choosy. I was like, which books am I going to buy? And I was like, I'm going to buy that book. And I read a lot of it on the train ride home. And I just remember like getting into Wolfpack and then being just kind of astounded by the story, but also the research that must have gone into the creative process. And I just wonder for that story in particular, but maybe for other works that you've worked on too that involve that level of research, how does research inform your creative process? And you know, I know you have this academic and creative side. How do you balance those things as you're also writing a story that's compelling?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, I think it does actually dovetail with what we were just talking about. I came to my life as a writer scholar kind of understanding that this is who I am and have always been. So even as an undergrad, I was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, which is a kind of track fellowship to prepare you for a career in academia. And I was writing plays, and, you know, basically like my Mellon mentor, the academic mentor, had no idea I had this playwriting thing going on. The playwriting teacher really didn't know that I was doing this other thing. And I wasn't like keeping it on the low in any way. I was just like, I'm doing these things. And I saw very clearly that they mesh, right? And research is one of the ways in which I think that's the case for me. So with Wolfpack, that story actually came from, in 2007, I think it was, I was TAing for a queer politics, basically a queer literature course with a professor who I was a PhD student, really admired the professor, and we were studying the Stonewall uprisings. We were teaching Stonewall uprisings. And the discussion had sort of turned in this direction where we were looking at some of the news coverage. And there was an article, I want to say in the Daily News, the New York Daily News, that referred to the rioters as a swarm of killer bees. And a comment came up in the class that, this kind of language would never be used to describe a group of queer people in 2007. And I had just read some of these headlines about the New Jersey Four, where they were referred to as, a swarm, as a wolf pack. And I thought, it's fascinating that the role of language in, at almost every level of that case was prominent for me, very clear for me, and yet wasn't really being talked about, And so that's what kind of pushed me to just read more. And as I saw more and more that, no one's really talking about this. So for example, that moment in the story where the Dwayne Buckle, the assailant who, in the trial is the victim, right? But the kind of assailant who says to them, well, I just tried to say hello. I didn't think I was, hurt. That's not the same as hurting a human being, right? This notion that his verbal violence is not violence. The judge saying, well, sticks and stones may break my bones, right? This is how you should respond to threats of violence, to verbal violence, to street harassment, threats of sexual violence, right? That, and then of course the moment when he calls one of the women an elephant, that also truly, that happened. That these kinds of linguistic violence are just not really recognized as violence and are really sort of extracted from and omitted from these stories. That was really important to me. And so that's what kind of pushed me to just read as much as I could. And then of course, both in my creative writing and in my scholarship, I think I kind of have to bring both to play. So like once I've done the research and sort of gotten the sense of the world and the facts that matter most to the story, then I get to play creatively and I get to sort of reframe and reimagine. So that theme of language was so important to me. I took everything that I found meaningful about language and what I had read, and then I kind of infused more, right? And sort of made sure that the textures of the language, their narrative voices, all of that really emphasized their interiority, the things that I think, again, were missing from that story. So I enjoy research, but only to a point. Like I like to, sort of research enough so that I feel safe and confident to play and imagine and be creative.
Wonderful.
Thank you. You want to jump in, Trapeta, or should I?
Yeah, so this is my other one that I had. Earlier in this class, we did some preliminary reading, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, and we also Alice Walker's story about her mother in the garden. One of the things that we had the students review the TED Talk about the dangers of a single story. Now I noticed when I first started talking to Yolanda about your work, she said, well, it's heavy, because I'm about to go to bed, I'm going to read these stories. And she said it's heavy, but I also noticed that in the stories there's moments of bursts of light and beauty. And as you were just talking, I'm wondering, when you approach a story, just thinking about that framework of what Chimamanda spoke about, the balance, right? The importance of not having this single lens. Who are you thinking about when you approach the story? You mentioned the language in that Wolfpack story and the importance of really dealing with that violence of it. Are you thinking about the audience? Are you thinking about the issue? Are you thinking about the urgency of the characters? What comes first for you in these stories?
That's a great question. The character. the characters, in fact. And, you know, I love that you frame this by kind of bringing us to the notion of, you know, multiple stories, the danger of a single story.
Mm-hmm.
In Wolfpack and in general, I think, you know, especially when writing about Black women, Black queer people, Black queer women especially, really bringing in the multiple voices, the multiplicities of our lives and our experience is crucial. That's what we almost never get in the media that we consume most often.
Very true.
And, you know, and so in some ways, I feel as though if I'm really honoring the truths, the multiple truths and nuances and textures and inner conflicts of my characters, then I am also speaking to the audience. I am also speaking to the urgency of the message, right? Because that's what the message is. It's sort of, what are these women experiencing? What are they going through? And in fact, you know, this is why I often shift point of view within my short stories, which, you know, there's another sort of, you know, from a class I took one day, a professor said, well, you know, the main rule of the short story is you have to stick with a single point of view, essentially. You can't have a successful short story if you switch point of view. And of course, I thought of all these examples, especially in modernism, you know, quote unquote high modernism, right? Like they switch point of view all the time. And again, you know, The Bluest Eye for Colored Girls, Sassafras Stripes and Indigo, I kind of came up as a writer understanding that you need that multiplicity, and that multiplicity is crucial to really convey the full texture and complexity of our stories. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do it. You said I can't do it. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Successful or not, you know, that's for readers, I guess, to gauge. But certainly,
I love that.
Yeah.
And the device that you use, those different points of view, I think it's so effectively done in your stories. But I love that it also gives a fullness to the characters, that we're not just one thing, one voice, one anything. And so I appreciate that. Thank you.
That means a lot. Thank you.
And they feel like people we know, that we are part of our family, or girls we grew up with, or girls you wanted to know. You know, that's, I felt a lot about those stories, girls I wanted to know, or girls you know, whose friendship I wish I had, you know, or who needed some friendship, who needed my friendship. So one of the questions from the class, I think this was from Joan, wanted to know what prompted you to write about a woman struggles with food addiction and negative body image. And she wanted to know if you saw these issues as feminist issues.
Yes, well, thank you, Joan, for that question. You know, 100% these issues are feminist issues. I think these are Black feminist issues. All Black feminist issues are feminist issues, right? And so I think, you know, there's layers to this. But yeah, absolutely, you know, my own experience, right, has definitely sort of prompted the way I think about fatness, embodiment, gender, and how the many ways in which I think fat are erased from feminist discourses, right? Conversations about gender, conversations about race. We're seeing that play out in real time, in fact, you know, right now, in terms of the ways in which Black women's experiences of sort of bodily, you know, vulnerability, our vulnerability to bodily harm is just erased off from the public record. And, you know, in terms of, again, fatness, body image, food and eating, the kind of first answer is, again, that's been a kind of crucial part of my own experience, and it's something that I think about often. You know, Yolanda, you were just saying sort of the girls who you want to be friends with, and also the girls who need friendship, and the girls who need one another in some ways, right? And that feeling of being sort of outside, you know, back to Audre Lorde and the notion of a sister outsider, right? Sort of to connect on experiences of being outside the norm, outside the standard. On a certain level, Black women's bodies are always cast in that location. But I think fat Black women's bodies, disabled bodies as well, are marginalized in a way that we often don't talk about. And it's interesting because within dominant feminist conversations about body and fatness and fat activism, Black women are often written out of those conversations because there's this myth, honestly, that like Black people don't really do that fatphobia thing, that, you know, Black people know that a man likes meat on his bones, or, you know, whatever the kind of like sexist, patriarchal, false narratives are, that really within Black communities, there's a ton of fat shaming, policing of, you know, food, of body shape and size. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because of course because of those feminist roots, right? Because those kinds of kind of epistemic violence and those kinds of marginalization, they are inseparable from racism, from sexism, from queerphobia, in fact, right? The fact that, to have a normative body means so much. If you have the right body, if you're slim, thick in the perfect way, it means you have access to the perfect relationship, usually a heterosexual one. And then that has this whole class implication, right? Because then you got your glow up going on and all of these things, that like, if these are the feminist issues that fatness entail, and yet we don't really talk about them. And recently there's been some really interesting scholarship on this issue, which I'm happy to see. So first of all, just in fat studies and dominant fat studies, white fat studies, there are people who talk about fat as a feminist issue. In fact, there's a book titled Fat is a Feminist Issue. But then, you've got scholars like Kathleen Lebesco, people like Marilyn Wan, who are thinking about fatness as, yes, kind of a way of thinking through sexism, misogyny. And then recently, Fearing the Body is this book, and of course I'm blanking on the name of the author, but it came out very recently, I think, in the last year or two. And it really traces, the second half of the title is like the racist roots of fat phobia, and it really sort of traces the connections between racism, fat phobia, sexism and misogyny. So recommend all of those. But yeah, I write it because I live it, and also because I think we're not talking about that enough. Thanks, Joan, right? It was Joan. Thank you, Joan.
Yes. I mean, it's very true, the things that you were saying, because even I just, when I think about just the attempts that people make to alter their body based on the images, and that's happening so in communities. I was just talking to different people at work, and people are having all of these different surgeries. No judgment here, but from everything from adding butt to this to that, and a lot of this is coming from not feeling a sense of fitting in. And these are young African-American women that I'm referencing. So this is big, and I don't think it's something that is talked about, because there's a misperception, as just, as you said, so much satisfaction and confidence with how people look, but actually there isn't in reality. So it's such an important topic to highlight.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about, when we talk about bodily autonomy, right? I think that has to mean we have the right to do what we want with our body, And so I think there's a difficult kind of nuance where anyone who does something with their body specifically because they want to meet an outside standard, certainly that wouldn't be my choice, you know what I mean? And
right.
To the kind of power of those standards in a way that, we have to acknowledge, right? That like, the standard must be real if we see so many people taking major steps to meet that standard.
Right.
And at the same time, I feel conflicted because I do feel that we all do have a right to do what we want with our body.
Exactly.
And so I think it's an ongoing conversation that really, I think you're right, we're going to kind of encounter it more and more, especially with social media, right? Like now, we don't know, 20 years ago, we didn't really necessarily know how people felt about their body every minute of the day. Now we know because they're posting about it every minute of the day.
Every minute.
So I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I think about this often. Again, how do we acknowledge, the damage and violence that some of these bodily expectations raise up, while also acknowledging that we should also be free to do with our body what we want to do, So it's an ongoing thing for me.
Great.
So Nivea Castro is somebody and was like, just tell us when's her novel about to drop. And Betsy, another member of our class, also wanted to know when the novel was coming out. Kind of want to take a different approach to this question though, and more about kind of how are you writing a novel, because like it's something I aspire to do one day. I feel like it's one of those like huge undertakings. And I'm also interested in it just in terms of the question of our course. Is like, we're reading about Black women who've often written under a lot of struggle and duress. Like, to have written the work that they've created, it's just like sometimes unbelievable about what they were going through personally,
Mhm.
what the country was going through. It's like, how did they ever just have time, energy, confidence to sit down and write and to continue to write, not just a poem or one story, but a whole novel. And I think about that today. Those constraints or those issues haven't really changed. Those struggles are still the same. We're still feeling racism, microaggressions, sexism, all kinds of phobias and shaming kind of get in the way of our writing. And so I'm just wondering kind of how you are writing a novel, kind of like technically how you go about it, but how are you doing it just emotionally, and what has that felt like in terms of a process that you could let us in on, especially for those of us who aspire to that?
Mhm.
So great questions. How I'm writing the novel. So the novel, it's been a long, long process. It began as my master's thesis, actually, way back in the day. I won't tell the year, but it was a minute ago.
Just a minute.
And it was a very different book. And the first draft, again, vastly different. First of all, it was about 500 pages. Which, who knows what's going on with those pages now. I think they're actually in the library at Temple. So anybody who's truly interested, you can go check that out. But, it's taken a number of different forms since then. Honestly, I think my first answer to that question is the kind of pragmatic, logistical answer, which was, I knew that I wanted to live a life as a writer. I also knew that I was going to need to pay the rent. And I knew that I love teaching. And so I thought, okay, the PhD is a great path, right? And if I establish a career as a professor, this will give me the support, the stability, the structure to have a life as a writer. And of course, at that time, I was like, yeah, and I'll just like get a PhD and write a novel at the same time. And it'll be great, and I'll be out here, and next thing you know, I'm on Oprah's couch, and
Oprah, yeah.
And so things turned out to things worked out differently. But honestly, it turns out that was a great plan for me, because again, I love teaching. I also really enjoy scholarship. And so I've been able to, about all the things we've been talking about, balancing my research with my creative writing and setting myself up with a foundation so that when the moments appear, I can really delve into my writing. So my pattern since grad school, since the PhD, really has been, I kind of go hard on the academic side, and then between semesters, I usually give myself a week, 2 weeks, whatever kind of time I can carve out to just kind of live in the world of my novel. As y'all know, I'm sure with folks you've talked to, every fiction writer is different. Some people need to really immerse themselves in the world of the fiction for a period of time. Others can kind of, on the train, like Morrison, for example, on the train in the morning, bust out a couple pages and keep it moving. I'm more the former. I need to kind of live in the world of the novel for at least a couple of days in order to feel like I'm moving forward with it. The academic schedule allows me those chunks of time. So, again, between semesters, certainly summer breaks. Right now I'm on sabbatical. And so that has been great. Now, while on sabbatical, I'm finishing up the academic book and revising the novel. So there is a little bit of balancing, but I can at least take a day for one and a day for the other, right? Rather than having to kind of have both on my plate at the same time. So that's the practical answer, is for me at least, it's about setting myself up with the kind of foundation I need to have the flexibility that I need to really immerse myself in the world of the novel. And then in terms of emotionally, the novel is about a lot of the things we're talking about, actually. It's about this idea of fatness, bodily autonomy, how it impacts families, or how family expectations around women's bodies specifically impact children and impact Black women and girls. And so, it's been a journey emotionally, for sure. And especially having sat with this novel for so many years in these little weeks and weekends and pockets of time, my perspective on these issues has shifted as well. So I think the novel is deepening and growing as that has happened. But, I guess my advice to anyone who is thinking of embarking on the journey of a novel, I think you have to really love it, right? It is a whole world, and you have to really be in love with the world you're creating. So my novel is set in Harlem. You mentioned Yolanda in the bio. I'm a proud Harlem native. In fact, I just got this T-shirt. That's like, it's from a company called She From, Black woman-owned company. My She From Harlem T-shirt. Anytime I see anything like that, I have to get it because I do feel strongly identified in that way. And, you know, so I love the world that I'm writing about. It's Harlem in the 1980s and 1990s. Biggie, my favorite rapper, perhaps favorite musical artist of all time, figures prominently in the novel. And I love the character, the main character that I'm writing about. And so that's a kind of love that, you know, you have to be willing to commit to for however long you're going to be writing this novel. And then I would say, again, try and set yourself up with the structure that you need in order to imagine and be free and play. Oh, and to the question, to Nivea's question about when is it going to drop? Thank you, Nivea. Soon, I hope. You know, we're going to cross fingers, light candles, send out good energy. Hopefully, we'll see it soon.
That's right.
That made me think about, and that question, it's a great answer. I just love hearing about Biggie. I thought about the poem that I was telling Yolanda about. I can't think of the poet now. She's from Boston. She has this poem about Biggie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a very interesting poem. I have to try to find that and send that to you.
I love that.
But it also made me think about a question that Yolanda and I said that we hated being asked.
Okay.
And Yolanda gave me her response based off of another writer's response. So we're going to ask you the question we don't like to get asked. How do you deal with writer's block?
I think that's a good question. I understand why. But I, you know, it's a necessary question, right? I feel like
yeah.
it comes up all the time because it's so very real. How do I deal with writer's block? I mean, I have to say, I guess maybe practically the answer for me is that I often have multiple projects that I'm working on. So if I feel like I can't do one day, there's something else on the agenda that I have to be attentive to, you know? And I feel fortunate that rarely do I ever have a moment where I feel like I can't write anything, you know? So it's, you know, if I feel blocked with the novel, that might be a sign that, okay, today is the day that I'm working on the academic book. And so for me, they're very different kinds of writing. So usually if I'm not in the headspace for one, it probably means I could be in the headspace for the other, you know? In those moments where I really don't have it and I can't write, I usually don't, to be honest. I usually read, you know, because I'm a voice-driven writer. When I read, you know, Jamaica Kincaid, I can read Jamaica Kincaid and
yes.
10 minutes, I'm ready to write.
Yes.
You know? Because the way her narrative voices work, they're that friend, Yolanda, that you were talking about, that you're like, oh, this is my friend. Like I feel this person. I'm inspired by this person, you know, and it's the reminder of how important our stories are and how important our voices are, but also it's the reminder of that possibility. And I feel this way with Ntozake as well, that whenever I read her stuff, I feel like, you know, this is what language can do. This is what language makes possible. And this is why it's urgently important. And so there's always that kind of push to the page, you know? So I would say reading, but also if you just really need to take a break, take a break.
Take a break. That's what you said, Yolanda. What do you do for writer's block?
That's what Tony said. Tony said that.
That's right.
So, you know, great minds, you know.
That's right. If Tony said it, it must be true. Let's be real.
It's like she was kind of like, what do? You just don't do anything. Just wait. Because she said she didn't want to write during that time because it was going to be some bad stuff anyway. So she was just like, I'll just wait for it to pass.
Right.
And, you know, I'll go in when the mood strikes me, you know?
Yeah. And also, I mean, I think, you know, as artists, right, I think it only helps us when we engage in as much art of different kinds as we can. So like, if today is not a writing day, maybe it's a day that you're going to go to the museum and look at some art. Maybe you're listening to music. Maybe you're going to dance, you know? I mean, all of these things look different in 2020, but maybe it's like you're going online and taking a dance class, which is something that I've been doing a lot of actually in quarantine, and just experiencing my body in that way, and like, you know, sitting with music that isn't music I chose for myself, into it. Those things can be inspiring, and they help you connect with the source of your writing that then might come into, you know, some story or poem down the line, or it might not, and it might just be that's how you express yourself that day, you know.
It's great. Thank you.
I wonder, just for this final question, because this is part of Betsy's question, and you kind of started with Jamaica Kincaid. I'm wondering if you would recommend other authors for these writers to read, having read what they've read, because these folks, they have a foundation now. They've been reading Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. They've read you, Chimamanda, Toni Cade
Zora,
Bambara, Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Dunbar Nelson. Where should they go from here?
Okay, so yeah, what a fantastic foundation. And I mean, they are lucky to have had this chance, I think, with y'all. And I'm sure that, you feel the same way. We talked about just how wonderful it is to create a space that really centers Black women's stories. So, just I'm excited for everyone involved in this class. And yeah, the syllabus just sounds incredible. So first I would say, like, don't hesitate to reread what you've already read, because that's a master list right there. And I think those are texts that you can keep coming back to. But in terms of short stories, I tend to love the short stories that are on that line between poetry and prose. And so Jamaica Kincaid's collection of short stories, At the Bottom of the River, which, when they came out, many folks were like, these are not stories, these are prose poems, these are lyric essays, right? Which is a term that we might use now. But I find them really beautiful, really, beautiful, I guess is the only way, beautiful in a very kind of complex, voice-driven way that really invite just reflection and analysis. And again, what she does with voice, I think, is unparalleled. So yes, I would say At the Bottom of the River, Gail Jones short stories, White Rat, right?
Yes.
For reasons. Like, again, these are people who have packed entire worlds into 10, 12 pages, really give you full characters that you know or want to know, and guide you through stories that are just breathtaking, And I think, Gail Jones, absolutely. Toni Cade Bambara, which I imagine a lot of your students will be familiar with, but her stories in Gorilla My Love, similar. And Bambara also, like, her voice she's a major kind of influence for me in terms of voice as well, especially for short fiction, like just the inner brilliance and beauty of Black women's kind of critical lives, and interior lives, she really gets. And then Disha Philia, her collection of short stories that just came out and just has like won a lot of prizes, actually. But
I think it's listed on the she's a finalist, I believe. For National Book Award.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. So The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. I haven't gotten to read through the whole collection, but just the premise, I think, is really important and exciting, right? Like understanding and thinking about the erotic lives of Black women. Again, all that we've been talking about, the interiority, the kind of unexpected complexity of Black women's experiences. So those are some that I would recommend. But again, I think don't hesitate to explore. I'm also reading Donna Allegua's collection of short stories, Witness to the Lives of Blonde Hip Hop Dancers. I think that's the title. Donna Allegua, who was a Black lesbian writer who was writing a lot, who had been writing a lot in the 80s into the 90s, I think. And this collection comes out, I think, in 2007, maybe it's a little bit earlier. And it's sort of it's a lesbian writing about lesbian dancers, Black lesbian dancers, and their sort of interracial love stories, and really interesting collection, that I'm enjoying immensely for a lot of the reasons we've been talking
about. Wow, amazing. I did read an excerpt of Disha, is it Philliard's part? One of the stories. Yeah, it was really, the title was so provocative. It just immediately draws you in. And Toni Cade is also one that's on our reading list this year as well. This is great.
Yeah,
that was a dynamite list.
Okay.
Yeah. And thank you for this conversation. This was like, I really needed this in the middle of my week. And I'm sure this conversation will be a value to the other folks in our group. And I just really appreciate your work, just everything that you do creatively, scholarly, just who you are. You're that friend too. You and that friend.
Yes.
I'm glad that we can
The
connect
kids do,
you.
right? Oh, my students got me acting like I'm 20 again. But yes, I feel the same. And thank you so much. Thank you both for having me. This has been a great conversation. And I can't wait for the day where we can do this in person and just kind of get up and hang out. I would really love
In
that.
person with some tea
Yes.
and snacks and just talking.
Yes.
Yeah, this is, I share this thing. It's just an absolute pleasure. This is a middle of a work day, and it just feels like I just took a whole weekend and
Yes.
plopped it into the middle of a work day.
Yes.
Just all the things that I like about the weekends,
Yes.
being connected in this way. So it's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel the same. Thank you.